Hey, thank you for tuning in to City Church's On-Demand Messages. My name is Josh, and I'm the pastor here, and we're so grateful that you are joining us from wherever you're coming from. In fact, we'd love to connect with you. If it's your first time, or maybe you're watching for a couple times, we would love for you to text guest to the number on the screen. We've got a free gift for you, and we would love to share a little bit more about who we are. Also, if you need prayer, if there's anything that we can pray for you about, even if as you're watching this message, something comes to your heart or mind that you need prayer for, we would love for you to text prayer to the number on the screen as well. And also, if you feel led to give this morning and be generous to the mission that God has called us to be for Jesus, for all people, and for our city, we would love for you to text give to the same number. We're currently in a series called Battleborn. We believe some of the greatest things in our life are born from some of the hardest and hard-fought battles that we face. And so this morning, we're going to jump right into this week's message. And again, if we can do anything for you, please let us know. Enjoy the message.
So the last few weeks, we've been in a series called Battleborn. And so Josh, through this series, has been talking through the story of David and Goliath. And I think the reality is that whether you've been in church your whole life or this is new for you, or maybe church in itself in the last few years is new, you probably have heard at least the phrase to defeat the giant, or maybe specifically this story of David and Goliath. And so what we've done in this series is we've walked through the fact that we had two armies. We had the nation of Israel and we had the Philistines on one hill, each hill opposite hills. And for 40 days, we find this giant named Goliath who comes down to the valley. And for 40 days, he says, hey, bring out a warrior, we'll fight, and whoever wins in that battle wins the battle. And so he would come for 40 days and he would taunt. And he would kind of not only say it by words, but just by pure size. Because here's the thing about Goliath. He was 9 foot 6 inches. That's huge. I'm 6'2", so that's like another half of me, all right? And so here he is, 9 foot 6 inches, and not only was he giant in size, he carried a spear, and the head of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And his body armor was said to weigh around 125 pounds. And so this is a very large giant who was very intimidating. And so for 40 days, he showed up in this battle scene between these two nations, and he would say, bring out a warrior to fight me. In our first week, we talked about this, that God sometimes, as we move in our lives, he calls us from the now ground to the new ground. But in between, just like this situation, there's a giant. In that first week, Josh talked about the giant of fear. And a lot of times that giant of fear is that we feel like we have to overcome the battle. There's this battle of fear because of self-reliance. And Josh talked about the fact that a lot of times we think that we have to be David, that we have to be like David and we have to do this. And he said, no, Jesus is our David. He is the one that steps in. And then last week, Josh talked about the giant of resentment, that sometimes when we're moving from the now ground to the new ground, that we hold hard to resentment. And the giant is someone who has hurt us, maybe family or friends, someone who has hurt us. And we finish with knowing this, that because Jesus has forgiven us, we can forgive. Because when we hold on to resentment, right, it turns into bitterness, and that giant just gets larger and larger and larger. And it doesn't allow us to move from the now ground to the new ground. What I want to do this morning is I want to talk to you and take you through a journey towards something that I'm sure, just like me, you have dealt with. You've been in this position or this place, you've run through this in your mind, and this is something that you have experienced just like me. You have sat here and you've said these words to yourself, maybe even out loud from your mouth, I am not good enough, strong enough, smart enough, experienced enough, healthy enough, or they look better, have more, are better, are smarter, or you've heard even someone else compare you to someone else or to something else. And they've poured these words over your life, comparing you to what they think you should be or they think they know about you. I think if we were all honest, we've been on the journey of comparison before. I mean, even if you just go back to middle school days and high school days, right? Or if you are a middle school and high schooler, how much did you compare yourself to those that are around you? In your job place, how much do you compare yourself? As a mother, as a father, as you look in the world that surrounds us, that's in our face with social media, how do you compare yourself? As a student here today, if you're a student in high school or middle school, how are you preparing yourself? This past basketball season, one of my boys, he's 11, and he played here in Spalding County, and he was elected into the All-Star team. And I thought that was an incredible honor and privilege, and I took great pride in it because I coached him when he was young. So there's a little bit of pride there on my part. But one thing that we didn't realize is as we got into the All-Star beginning and practice and got ready, they posted a scrimmage game for us. And so as we get into the gym, we find out, okay, that the All-Star team here in Spalding County was 12 and under, with many of those kids being on the underside of that, many of them being 11 years old. And the county age group for the surrounding counties that we would be playing in the All-Star game, they were 13 and under, with many of them being on the 13 side of things. So you can do a lot of growing between the ages of 11 and 13. Josh, if you've met our lead pastor, he's been that same height since he was like 12. So he went from like this, and then now he's like 6'6". So you can grow a lot in that time frame. And so I remember walking into that gym, and my boy's with me, and he looks at me, and he goes, "Dad, they're as tall as you are. What are we going to do?" And right away, there was this giant in front of him as comparison, right? He immediately sees this point they are now. The new ground is to win this all-star scrimmage, and there's this giant of comparison that right away has defeated not only him, but the entire team. For good reason, right? I mean, these guys are big. And so I remember him coming to me and said, "Dad, what are we supposed to do?" You know, and he's kind of just very timid about this. And I say, "Son, the best thing you can do is realize that what you have is enough and go play it as hard as you can." And that's what he did. And they didn't win. But he learned something that day. Because that first half, they came out and they were scrappy, and they actually played with these guys who were way older than them. So it boosted a little bit of their morale. Enough to help them, right? It may not be now, but as they move to the new ground of growing in the sport of basketball, there's going to be a moment where they go back and they say, "Hey, I remember when I was 11 and we played these 13-year-old kids that were as tall as my dad, and we actually played with them some. We actually kept up in the game with them some." Comparison can quickly, right? It can completely defeat us. At some point in your life, if you're like me, you've battled with comparison. You have seen the new ground, but the battle's not worth it because you believe you're not in a position in the now ground to overcome the giant and move towards the new ground. I think we can probably all agree that we live in a time and place where comparison is probably at its greatest. And why would comparison be at its greatest, right? Because you get to see everybody's best every day on Facebook and Instagram and whatever other social media platform, right? You go on and you get to see what are people putting out there. For the most part, everybody's putting out their best, right? And so that is the greatest move, I'll be honest, of the enemy, just to move us into comparison. Because we see what they have, we see what they're doing, we see the smiles, and we think, well, I don't have that. There's no way I can get into the new ground. When you get to this place in your life where your now ground is that you're struggling in your marriage or in your finances and your health, your workplace, your emotions, your hope, and that your new ground is that joy would exist in your marriage, maybe that you would get out of debt, maybe that you would have joy in your work, or maybe that you would just feel whole. You would feel like you have purpose. You see what so-and-so is doing, what so-and-so has, and you begin to compare. And instead of moving from the now ground to the new ground, you see the giant of comparison, and you say, "Nope, I'm going to stay right here. This is where I'm good. I can't move because so-and-so, because of this." Your giant in that moment is comparison. Your giant that is overcoming you in this battle is comparison. In our series, we've been in a story about this young teenage boy by the name of David who fights this giant named Goliath. And I'm going to just give you the end of the story so we can backtrack. At the end of the story, find that David actually takes a stone in a sling and whirls it around, and you have this massive giant coming in, and he lets loose of that stone, hits the giant in the head, and the giant dies. So this young man faces this giant, and at the end of the story, he wins with just a stone and a sling. So for 40 days before this point, Goliath has come forward, and he said this in 1 Samuel 17:10. This is where I will be pretty much the entire morning. And this is what happens. And the Philistine said, so this is Goliath the giant, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And so for 40 days continually, he shows up with his massive giant self, and he says, send someone to me. Let's do this, anybody. I will take on anyone. And here's the response from Israel. In 1 Samuel 17:11, when Saul, who is the king of Israel, and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Every day for 40 days, they heard this. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. Why? Because they're comparing, okay, I'm 6'2". I measured this on Friday. Right about the top of the ceiling right here is about 9 feet, 6 inches. Could you imagine? I mean, I've got to just agree with a minute for the Israelites that I would probably back up a little bit. I would probably be the guy that they're like, hey, why don't you go today? I say, nope. Do you see me? And do you see that guy? There is no way that I am going to battle with this giant. I do not compare to him in any battle in our lives. It's always useful for the enemy, right? It's always useful for him in our life as we move to new ground, as God is moving us. It's always useful for him to demoralize you by comparing you to what is in front of you and striking fear into your heart. It's one of the things that he uses, that he would demoralize you by comparing you to what's in front of you. And saying those things that maybe you've said to yourself, I'm not good enough, I'm not strong enough, I'm not. First, he wins because maybe it keeps you from even going to battle because you're so afraid that you don't have enough, you're not worth enough. And second, if you do make it into battle, you'll fight with fear and apprehension. My son, that day when they played the game, they started that first half of the game, and they were strong, and they were battling, and the second half came, and this kid almost dunked. And guess what happened to the whole team of almost 11-year-olds? Done. From that point on, the other team just slaughtered us. It demoralized them. They went in a little strong, but because they had that moment of comparison in the front of the game where we aren't as tall as they are, we're not as big as they are, they made it to that front point, but the second place came, and they weren't able to fight through it. This is a significant strategy the devil uses against believers. The enemy will always attempt to shout louder and longer, pointing out that what you have is not enough. He's always going to say, what you have is not enough. You're not enough. You're not enough. Everyone, those 40 days, saw it. They noticed the giant of comparison. It was not hard to miss. If I brought in someone that was even 7 foot in here, you would notice, right? You would see them. Everyone noticed this giant of comparison. Everyone saw what was going on. But there was this young man who was a teenager that day that saw something different. This boy was named David. David was the son of Jesse, and he also had 3 brothers. David was a shepherd boy, and David had been sent this particular day, as this battle's going back and forth, he had been sent this particular day to take food to his brothers. So dad says, hey, David, I want you to take some food to your brothers, take care of them, head to the battle, and then come back. And so David gets the things together, he leaves, and he heads to the battle. At this point in his life, he really only knew being a shepherd boy. He was not prepared for battle. He was not a warrior. He'd not been trained to be a warrior. And so David shows up to the battle, and he hears this giant challenge and speak against the nation of Israel and God. And this is what happens in 1 Samuel 17:26. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, David's first reaction wasn't like, wow, look at that guy, he's huge. His response was, who is this that he would stand here and defy the army of God? He didn't see the comparison of giant. He just saw that something was going against where God was in the now ground, trying to move to the new ground. David doesn't see this giant of comparison. He sees something in the way of the new ground. But don't worry. Someone is going to remind David of who he is and who the giant is. Have you ever been moving to the new ground in life? Maybe it's in your marriage, and you're trying to move to the new ground where your marriage is the marriage that God designed, and you get somewhere and someone reminds you of your past. Someone reminds you of who you are and what you've done. They compare you and say, well, I see that you're moving towards this way, but you remember who you are and what you've done? This is what happens for David. In 1 Samuel 17, verse 28, now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And so here's David's oldest brother, and he hears David walking around continuing to ask this question about, why are we standing here? Who does this giant think he is? And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? He'd come to give his brothers food. And so here his brother is, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Now, I think it's really wild because in this time and era, a shepherd was not one of those jobs that you put on the top level of things. But not only did his brother remind him that he was just a shepherd, he said, who'd you leave those few sheep with? Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. He reminds his brother that he's just a shepherd boy of a few sheep. Maybe this is something that you get reminded of. Maybe you feel like who you are, what you do, your job, maybe your call as a father or a mom or a family member, a sister or a brother, whatever it may be. Maybe you feel like it's just a shepherd boy. It's just a few sheep. And the enemy reminds you of that every day. Well, you're just. I think about you as parents who are starting virtual school tomorrow, and some of you have transitioned into the life of homeschool parent, and maybe you've had to jump into that as your job at home now. You had to leave your job so that you could be home, and I guarantee you this is going to come into your mind and your heart. Well, I'm just here. I'm just doing this. This is something that the enemy reminds us of. You're just a shepherd boy of a few sheep. Where you are now, right? This is just who you are. So his brother points out where he is now, and that where he is now he thinks doesn't matter. And he also assumes that he knows his brother's heart and motives. He assumes that he knows why David's there and what his motives are. Begins to compare what he thinks is really going on in the heart of David. And I love David's reaction because I grew up with brothers. Anybody grew up with brothers? If you grew up with brothers online, just kind of, I grew up with brothers. How many of you, come on, let's just be honest. How many of you ever just gotten little wrestle matches with your brothers? Anybody getting a little, not like just all out brawls, but just, So if my brother comes up to me and I'm there to feed him, and he's like, nah, I know why you're here. I'd just be like, oh yeah? You know why I'm here? But David has this reaction, just blows my mind. Verse 29 and 30. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And then he turned away from him toward another. I'm on a mission. I'm in the now ground, Eliab, and I see what you're saying. I'm a shepherd boy, but I'm going over here. God has called me to do something, and nothing's going to prevent me. No comparison of who you think I am is going to take me to that point. So he turns away towards someone else, and he continues to ask the same question and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. And so he's just going from person to person on this mission of going from the now ground. Okay, listen, Israel, we're here, and this guy is taunting not only us, but he's defying our God. The new ground is that this giant needs to be conquered. And so I'm going forward. And I'm not going to compare who I am to who this giant is because I know there's someone that compares way better than him. So David moves on mission. David made a decision that we can learn from. Nothing compares to the new ground God is calling you to. Nothing. If God is calling you to something new, nothing compares to that new ground. And so whatever it is that you're stuck in the moment of moving from the now to the new, there's no giant of comparison that compares to what God wants to do. Nothing. So David moves forward on mission. And if this comparison wasn't enough, it just keeps going. Have you ever sat in comparison so long that you really just start to believe what you're saying to yourself and what the enemy is saying about you? Have you ever sat in it so long that you began to wake up every morning and you began just to believe that lie? And David's continuing, if it wasn't enough, here comes more. Many times the giant we face is not what is on the new ground, but who we see ourselves as on the now ground compared to everyone else. It's not what's here, but it's what is happening in the now ground. The king of Israel hears about David asking questions, and so the king of Israel, Saul, sends for David, bring him to me. And in verse 32 through 33, this is what we see. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. So David at this point is like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go fight the Philistine. Saul, who had seen many battles and had seen many warriors as the king of Israel, he said to David, you are not able. No, you're not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he, talking about the giant Goliath, has been a man of war from his youth. So right away, King Saul, experienced in battle, it says, David, you are too young and you have not been trained in battle. This guy is not only a giant, but he's been trained as a youth till now to be a warrior. You are only just a young man. So here's David again, and the giant that he faces is comparison. He's a youth. He's not a warrior, but David still insisted. And the thing for me that's really wild about the story is for David, some of these things were true. I mean, he was young and he was a shepherd boy. But he knew that that wasn't what he needed to base his life on. That if he took the things on the outside and compared them to the things on the outside, he would probably lose. But he knew that there was another place that he could go to compare things to. And so Saul, stating he's young, stating he's not ready for war, he assumes that he needs more. He needs more to move from the now ground to the new ground. He needs more to conquer this giant. And so here's what happens. In 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 39, so after David had made the decision, I'm going to do it, this is what Saul said, or what Saul did. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. Now, what's so important to know about this is Saul is the king of Israel. So Saul would have the best armor. He would have the best of all. Because what do you want to do if you go into battle? You want to protect the king. And so he's going to have the best of everything. And so David is given the best that he could have. The best helmet, the best sword, the best coat of mail. The armor is placed upon him. In verse 39, and David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And so David put them off. He was given the best, and still said, no, I don't need this. Can I ask you this question? Is it possible that right now in your life of comparison, you are asking yourself this question, if I just had, then I could? You know, the assumption for anyone in that battle would have been, well, if I just had better armor, or if I was just a little taller, or if I just had, then I could. But for David, it wasn't, well, yeah, I do need this armor. It was, no, this doesn't work. And there's a reason. There's something that we need to understand. Oftentimes we try to fight with another person's armor. There's times in our lives where we're moving in the battle of life and we're like, if I just have what they have. We try to pull in and fight with someone else's armor. We see God doing something maybe through someone else, and we try to copy it without really making it our own. God's work is never most effectively done in this way. Why? Because here's the thing. God made no one else like you. There's nobody else like you at all. One of my favorite things to learn as a kid is that all of our fingerprints, they're all different. There's no one like you. So David trying to pull on someone else's armor, it didn't work. It wasn't created for him. It wasn't made for him. So let us lean in and understand that God has specifically created you. He specifically, praise God there's not any more Warrens, we'd be in trouble. But God has specifically made you. He made no one else like you. So David has this crazy confidence. Here is this shepherd boy with no training in battle, and he's going up against not only a giant, but one that had been trained. Why is he so confident? Why is he not stuck in the now ground fighting the battle of comparison, but he is moving to the new ground? In verse 34 through 36, David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. Okay, thank you, David, for the statement of keeping sheep. Could you imagine Saul hearing this shepherd boy talking about keeping sheep? And when there came a lion or a bear, it took one of the lambs from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. I mean, come on, that's insane. Can you just soak that in for a second? That if a lion or a bear came and took one of the lambs, he chased them down to rescue it. And if it did not release the lamb, he would grab it by its beard and kill the lion or the bear. Verse 36, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. I mean, David's like, listen, and I think this is something that we've got to set in for a minute. God has been preparing me in the now ground. He's been working in me in the now ground. I mean, what everybody else saw as a shepherd boy, I knew he was training me for something today. What everyone else saw as rescuing a lamb, I see it now that he's been preparing me to defeat a giant. I see what he's been doing in the new ground. So let us not, in the now ground, let us not discredit what God is doing now to prepare us for where we're moving. Because here's where his confidence comes from. In verse 37, and David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will, not might, maybe he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Is it possible that God has been preparing you all along for the new ground? I mean, is it possible that right now in the now ground that God has been preparing you all along for the new ground? But you're sitting here comparing where you are in the now ground and looking at the new ground and saying, I cannot, in my marriage, I cannot get there. In my finances, I cannot get there. In my workplace, I cannot get there. In my life as a believer to share who Jesus is, I cannot get there. But all along, he's been preparing you. And maybe you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus. Is it possible that right now, in this now ground, he's preparing you? God has been praying. Is it possible that God has been preparing you all along for the new ground? Look where he has delivered you from before. How has he prepared you? I would probably say in confidence that if you know Jesus this morning for any length of time, you could go back to your life and you could say, I can see what God did here to prepare me for now. As the story prevails, as we've discussed the last few weeks, David goes to meet Goliath. Even Goliath himself calls David in verse 42, he basically calls him worthless. Like, why would you even send this guy out to me? He is worthless. Goliath was on that other side of comparison, right? David could have sat in the comparison side of, I'm not tall enough, big enough, prepared enough. But David sat on the side of comparison where he said, I'm better than you. Because that can be the other side of comparison, right? I don't need, I'm too good. I think it's possible that a lot of what we deal with in the sin of racism today sits in that category where it's a comparison to the other extreme that I'm better than. After the taunting of Goliath, reeling out these words of how much better he is, David quickly returns with words of courage grounded in his confidence in God. And this is what he says in verse 47. Finishes before he takes that stone with the sling and winds it to kill the giant. This is what he says. And that all this assembly, so everyone that is gathered here, may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Can I encourage you for a moment that maybe if you're in a life of comparison, maybe just grab that verse, the last phrase, for the battle's the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. If you're trying to move into new ground in your marriage, in your finances, in your workplace, in your life, with your kids, with your grandkids, with your family, and maybe you just need to say, you know what, the battle is the Lord's, and he will give this battle over. You see, that day for David was filled with comparison. His brother had something to say. The king had something to say. The giant had something to say. But David, being some of these things, young, untrained, he did not fall into the comparison trap. What he decided to do, instead of focusing on the outside, he decided to focus on what he had in the inside. Who was with him in this moment? And he would take those stones from the brook and he would take them with him to that spot to meet Goliath, and he would take that stone in that sling, release it, strike the giant in the head, and kill the giant. I think that many of us would probably agree that if we had the choice, didn't know you were going to see a sword in church today, did you? I think that many of us, if we had to choose, that day for David, he had an option, right? There's a giant with all this incredible armor. And I have the opportunity to take the king's armor. At least maybe if I get hit once, maybe I'll survive. Maybe that helmet from the king will protect me. And so I think if we were real and if we were honest, if we are David in the situation or in our lives, we want to move from the now ground to the new ground. And if we had to compare and we had to choose, if I said, hey, everybody, after church today, we're going to go have a big battle. Everybody pick a weapon. You can have a stone or a sword. I think the reality is that we probably all would pick what? A sword. I mean, especially a samurai sword, let's be honest. I think that sometimes we really get into this place and we think we need more. If I had the best weapon, if I just had, or if he just, or she just, if my kids would just, if the school would just, if I just had that sword, if I just had that best, then I could move from this now ground to this new ground. But what's so incredible to me about David is he chose something that God was already doing in his life and moved to the new ground. A stone was something God had already been doing in his life. He had used these already, defending the sheep. And God knew that David was enough when God was behind him. And so David that day knew what to pick. He knew that he didn't have to look on the outside, but simply look on what God was already doing on the inside to get from the now ground to the new ground. There was no comparison to who God is in his life. When we focus on the outside, we miss the power on the inside. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1 through 2, it says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. And this verse is here because in chapter 11, we find the stories of all these men and women of faith who overcame all these incredible things. And it says, because of their witnesses of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down. Is it possible today that your life is full of the weight of comparison? And that you're seeking with everything you can to find that shiny sword? If I just had, but in reality, God says, throw it off, strip it off, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Comparison can trip us up. It can make us fall as we head into battle. It can trip us up. And here's how we move forward. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. Here's how we do this. Here's how David did this. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Here's the thing, when we fix our eyes on becoming the champion, when we fix our eyes on who we are and what we need, when we fix our eyes on becoming the champion, we lose sight of the champion, Jesus, who wants to fight for us. You see, it wasn't David that day who really won the battle. It was God. Because nowhere would we be like, yep, this is gonna beat a 9'6" guy wielding a lot larger sword like this. But David, through God, defeated that giant. I remember getting a call from Josh our lead pastor here at City Church, almost a year and a half ago. I was at a church, me and my wife, in Florida for 15 years, and we really felt like it's what God wanted us to do for the rest of our lives, to be down in Florida, and incredible church that we love so much there. Josh said, hey, you want to come help plant a church in Griffin? And in my head, I didn't say this to Josh, I said no. And honestly, the reason I said no is because in the now ground, I feel like I didn't have enough of what I needed to be a part of a church plant. If you're wondering what a church plant is, this is a new church. And there was churches that came together and helped us get going and where we are. So this is a brand new church in Griffin. We've been here about a year and a half. And so I sat in that now ground and thinking, there's no way that God can do this, and my wife and I can do this. And we kept saying, well, if we just had a little more of this or a little more of that, then maybe we could go to Griffin and we could help plant a church. And some of you know the story. The day that God made that call clear, we were at a church planting conference. We were in the car and we were praying together, and we kept coming back to the word fear, 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 fear. And we were honestly comparing where we were and where God wanted us to go, and thinking, we can't make this happen. We can't move our family after we've been in Florida for 15 years. We can't raise our support. We can't move to Griffin, Georgia. And we walk into that church planning conference that day, and we start talking to this guy, and he says, hey, can I pray for you guys? We've been talking for a little bit. He said, I want to pray for you guys. I said, okay, sure. Of course, I would love that. So he begins to pray, and he stops in the middle of his prayer. And he says, I don't know what's going on here, but God wants me to tell you, you don't have to fear anymore. I look over, my wife is like, she's sobbing, and I'm right behind her, because I realized that for so long in that time of prayer, I thought that we needed a sword. But in reality, God said, no. I've been preparing you in the now ground to move you where you don't have to compare, and you only have to look to me, to fix your eyes on me. There's no one that compares to me, and we can move to the new ground. So maybe God has been doing things in your life as a parent, as a spouse, as an employee, as a friend. And he's saying, listen, I've been working. The stone, I promise you, with me, we can slay the giant. You see, when our confidence is in Christ, who is beyond compare, the giant of comparison falls. When our confidence is in the one who compares to no one else, whose love is greater than anyone else, whose power is greater than anyone else, who sees us and made us, when we move into only confidently focusing our eyes on the one who is beyond compare, the giant of comparison falls. So, what is the sword that you're looking for today that you think you need? What is it? I encourage you to say, you know what, God? You're enough. You're enough. I may not be able to do this, but you are enough. You are enough. What we want to do in this time is we just want to sing a song over you. And what I encourage you to do is, this is sung, is just kind of listen to the words, kind of soak them in for a moment, and think about, God, where am I at in the now ground? And where is this comparison? Let me, God, see that there is a victory. So if you'll just listen as we sing.